Hi everybody, it's Mr. Castleman here with another video. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 7, Sections 1, 2, and 3, and we'll be doing the guided reading and notes for Chapter 7. So you're going to need TCI opened up to Chapter or Lesson 7, Geography and the Early Settlement of Egypt, Cush, and Canaan, and then that should be opened up to Section 1. And then you should have the Chapter 7 guided reading and notes open to this page, or this slide. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to write our name here. So go ahead and write your name in there. And then once you've done that, we can go over to the next slide, which is the directions. It says Step 1, open TCI and the guided reading and notes video. You should have already done that. Step 2 is you're going to read along with me, and then Step 3 is you're going to complete your notes as I take notes. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we are going to read Section 1. Section 1, Introduction. In this chapter, you will explore how geography affected three civilizations that arose in northern Africa and southwestern Asia. These were the civilizations of the ancient Egyptian, Kushite, and Israelite peoples. The Egyptians settled along the Nile River in the northeast corner of Africa. Their civilization lasted from around 3100 BCE to 350 CE. The Kushites settled to the south of Egypt, along the southern part of the Nile River. Their civilization began around 2000 BCE and lasted until 350 CE. The Israelites, later called Jews, settled northeast of Egypt along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea in about 1800 BCE. Although the Jews were forced from their homeland in 70 CE, their civilization continues to flourish today. Environmental factors greatly affected where people settled. Three important factors were water, topography, which is the shape and elevation of the surface features of the land, and vegetation, plant life. These three factors were determined by each area's physical geography. Physical geography includes mountains, rivers, valleys, deserts, climate, and the fertility of the soil, which means how good it is. In this chapter, you will learn why water, topography, and vegetation were important to early human settlement. You will explore the physical geography of the lands of the ancient Egyptians, Kushites, and Israelites. You'll find out how environmental factors in these places affected people's choices of where to live. Okay, so that's Section 1. Now we're going to go back to our slideshow here. We're going to move on to the next part. All right, so we see that the next slide has this painting that we've looked at before. Let's keep going. All right, so the next slide says Section 1, Introduction, Directions. The environmental factors of an area affect where people live. Examples of these factors are water, vegetation, and weather. Look at the picture on the previous slide. Write down three environmental factors that might affect your choice of where to settle. So let's look back at this slide again. You're going to think of three factors that would affect where you would settle if you had to settle somewhere in this land that's shown in the painting. So write down three different environmental factors that might affect your choice of where to settle. So for example, you might want to settle near this river here. So you might say that one factor is I'd like to live close to the river, so I'll have drinking water and water for farming. So that's an example of an environmental factor. So fill out all three of these. You can pause this video until you finish this slide. Okay, let's go on to Section 2. We're going to read Section 2. All right, here's Section 2. Environmental factors and early human settlement. In ancient times, environmental factors influence people's choices of where to settle. Three important environmental factors were water, topography, and vegetation. Water. The most important environmental factor in early human settlement was water. Physical features like rivers, lakes, and inland seas were good sources of fresh water. Water was important for many reasons. People needed fresh drinking water to live. They also bathed and washed things in fresh water. Bathing and washing helped prevent disease. Water was a source of food. People caught fish from rivers, lakes, and seas. They hunted water birds and other animals that gathered near water. In addition, farmers needed water to grow their crops. For this reason, farmers often settled near rivers. A river's natural flooding could help irrigate their farms. Farmers could also dig canals or trenches to direct river water to their crops. For example, farmers in Mesopotamia dug canals for this purpose. Water was also used for transportation. Cities and towns often use rivers as highways. People traveled in boats to visit relatives and trade goods. Towns near the sea could trade goods with countries far away. Topography. A second environmental factor was topography. Topography refers to the shape and elevation of the land. It includes features like mountains, hills, plains, valleys, and deserts. The topography of an area was important for early human settlement. Farmers preferred to settle in flat, open areas such as plains and valleys. Large, flat spaces gave farmers room to plant crops. Also, the rich soil in coastal plains and river valleys was excellent for growing these crops. Mountains were less friendly to human settlement. Steep mountains were hard to cross. Their jagged peaks, cold temperatures, and rocky land made farming difficult. Deserts also discouraged settlement. They were hot and dry. They contained very little water for farming. Sandstorms occurred when strong winds carried dense clouds of sand that could block out the sun. The intense heat, lack of water, and sandstorms made travel and living in the desert difficult. Vegetation. A third environmental factor was vegetation, or plant life. There are many kinds of vegetation, such as trees, bushes, flowers, grass, and reeds. The crops people grow are also a type of vegetation. Many aspects of physical geography affect vegetation. A climate with mild weather and regular rain is good for plant life. Fresh water supports the growth of vegetation. The areas around rivers and lakes are usually green and lush. Mountains are often covered with thick groves of trees. Dry and hot deserts have very little vegetation. The vegetation in an area influenced early human settlement in several ways. Most important, plants were a source of food. People could eat the wild plants available and also the crops they planted. Vegetation had other uses as well. People learned to make many useful products out of plants, including baskets, tools, medicine, rope, and even paper. Trees provided shade from the hot sun, and plants and flowers added natural beauty to a place. Wherever people settled in the ancient world, water, topography, and vegetation were important factors. Let's look at how these environmental factors influenced the early settlements of the Egyptians, Cushites, and Israelites. Okay, now we're going to go back to our slideshow here. So we read section 2. Let's move on and take some notes here. In ancient times, environmental factors influenced where people settled. We just read about that. Of course, environmental factors still influence where people live. Three important environmental factors are, and you should remember this, water, topography, and vegetation. Those are three of the most important environmental factors that affect where people live. So we can take notes here and say that three important environmental factors are water, and then we'll go to our second one, topography, so that's kind of the shape of the land. Are there mountains? Is it a flat area? And then the third important environmental factor is vegetation. So are there trees? Are there crops that can grow someplace? Okay, now let's go in depth on each of these important environmental factors. So the most important environmental factor in early human settlement was water. Here's a question for you. How did water affect people's choices of where to settle? Write down 3 ways from section 2. So you're going to go back to section 2 over here, and you're going to look for 3 ways that water affected people's choices of where to settle. And then you're going to write down those right here. So I'll give you an example. So one way that water affected people's choices of where to settle was that people needed fresh drinking water to live. That's a really important way that water affects people's choices of where they're going to live. So now I know that because I went back to section 2 and I looked through it, and I looked here and said that read that water was important for many reasons. For example, people needed fresh drinking water to live. Now there are a number of different things here that you can write down as you complete the notes here. So please fill that out and pause this video while you do that. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So topography. Topography is the shape and elevation of the land. It includes features like mountains, hills, and plains. So the first thing I want you to do is to go over here on the left side and copy and paste a photo from Google that shows what topography is. So you could go to Google here and you could search mountains, for example. And you could get an image of a mountain, right? And you could copy it like that, and you could paste it here. And then you'd have a nice photo that kind of represents topography. So why don't you go ahead and pick out a picture to go there. All right. The question for this is similar to the question for the section on water. How did topography affect people's choices of where to settle? Write down 3 ways from section 2. So you're going to go back to section 2. You're going to look for 3 ways that topography affected people's choices of where to settle. One example that I'll give you is that farmers grew crops in large flat areas. So these were plains, right? Large flat areas. People grew crops there. So the shape of the land, if it was flat, it might be a good place for you to settle if you're looking for a place to farm. So find 2 other ways that topography affected people's choices of where to settle and add those in. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Vegetation. A third environmental factor was vegetation. Vegetation, of course, includes trees, flowers, crops. It's really the plant life that lives in an area. Similar to what we did on the last slide, I want you to find a photo from Google that shows what vegetation is, and I want you to paste it here on the left side of the screen. Okay, and our question is similar to the last 2 questions we've done. How did vegetation affect people's choices of where to settle? Write down 3 ways from section 2. So I'll give you 1 way that vegetation affected people's choices of where to settle. So vegetation near rivers and lakes was usually green and lush, and it allowed people to grow crops. So that's a way that vegetation affected people's choices of where to settle, where to live. So come up with 3 different ways and put those in here. All right, let's move on. So the next thing we're going to do as we go to our next slide here is we're going to read section 3. So let's go over here to section 3. Okay, I'm going to go over to section 3. Section 3 is environmental factors and the early settlement of Egypt and Kush. The Egyptians and Kushites both settled near the Nile River. The Egyptians lived along the northern part of the river. The Kushites lived to the south. Why did settlements in these areas cluster around the Nile River? Let's look at the physical features of Egypt and Kush to see how environmental factors favored settlement near the Nile. Now, if I go over to the left side of my screen here, I can click and I can get a good look at this map here that shows where the Nile River Valley was. You can see it's that green area. You can see it goes down here. And then we can see where Egypt is. There it is, in this area here. We can also see where Kush was, so further south along the Nile River. All right, let's keep reading here. Physical features of Egypt and Kush. The most important physical feature in ancient Egypt and Kush was the Nile River. Flowing north from East Africa, the Nile created a long, fertile valley that ended in a marshy delta where the river emptied into the Mediterranean Sea. The Nile River Valley was bordered by the Libyan Desert to the west and the Nubian Desert to the east. These sandy deserts were extremely hot and dry. Most people avoided these areas, although the deserts did play one important role in the settlement of Egypt and Kush. They formed a natural barrier that helped protect people living in the Nile River Valley. The deserts did not support large settlements, and few invaders wanted to risk crossing these harsh places. We can see a picture of the desert to the right here. On the north, Egypt was bordered by the Mediterranean Sea. Settlers could not drink its sparkling salt water, but the sea was rich in fish and other kinds of seafood. It was also a waterway that linked ancient Egypt to other civilizations. To the east of Egypt and Kush was a long channel of very salty water called the Red Sea. The climate in this area was hot and dry. Much of the land near the Red Sea was desert. Environmental factors and human settlement in Egypt and Kush. Environmental factors in ancient Egypt and Kush greatly favored settlement near the Nile River. Most important, the Nile was a source of fresh water in an area that was mostly desert. The lack of water in the deserts made them unfit for farming. But in the Nile River Valley, the river provided natural irrigation and fertilization. Every summer, the river overflowed its banks. The floodwaters soaked the dry ground for several weeks. As the water level decreased, a thin layer of silt, which are very fine particles of rock, was left behind. This soil was perfect for farming. If you remember that video we watched, class, you'll know that sediment that was left over, those nutrients, was called hapi. That was an Egyptian word for it. Also, where there was fresh water, people were more likely to find fish to catch and animals to hunt. The abundant wildlife in the Nile region included fish, ducks, geese, hippos, crocodiles, giraffes, and ostriches. The topography of the river valley also encouraged human settlement. In the south, parts of the Nile ran through narrow valleys between steep hills, but there was also wide, flat areas of land around deep bends in the river. These flat areas were good for farming. In the north, wide plains were watered by the Nile's annual flooding. Vegetation was rare in the dry deserts, but it was plentiful, that means there was a lot of it, in the Nile River Valley. Useful plants included reeds and a tough water plant called papyrus. People wove reeds into baskets and roofs for their huts. Papyrus was used to make rope and paper, and the rich farmland was good for growing crops like wheat and barley. Okay, let's do the notes for this final section that we'll be doing today. So we'll go to the next slide here. It says Section 3, Environmental Factors and the Early Settlement of Egypt and Kush. So the directions for this slide are to label Egypt and Kush on the right, on the map to the right. So here's the map here on the right. You'll recognize it from the reading in Section 3. And I want you to label where Egypt is and label where Kush is on this map. So go ahead and do that. And if you need to check, because you're not exactly sure, you don't remember, you can look at the map in Section 3. And I'll also remind you that Egypt was in the north and Kush was further south along the Nile River. All right, let's go to our final slide for today. It's called Environmental Factors and the Early Settlement of Egypt and Kush. The Egyptians and Kushites settled near, well, we know where they settled. They settled near the Nile River. So we can write that in. They settled near the Nile River. Why did they settle there? Well, there are a lot of different reasons why the Egyptians and the Kushites settled near the Nile River. So let's talk about 4 of them. So one important one is that the Nile supplied fresh water for drinking and for irrigation. So let's write that in. The Nile supplied fresh water for drinking and irrigation. So make sure you're copying this down as I copy it down. The second reason that the Egyptians and the Kushites settled near the Nile was that the Nile made the farmland fertile when it flooded. So the Nile made the farmland fertile, that means good for growing, when it flooded. Now the third reason that the Egyptians and the Kushites settled there was that the topography around the Nile was flat and good for farming, especially in the north. So the Nile was the land around the Nile River was especially flat in the north, which was really good for farming. It's not great to farm in an area where there's a lot of hills or mountains. It's much easier when the land is flat. All right, and our final reason why the Egyptians and Kushites settled near the Nile River is that the Nile River was good for vegetation. A lot of stuff could grow there. So for example, reeds grew along the river and people made baskets out of the reeds. All right, so copy that down, and once you do that and you've finished all the notes for this chapter, you are good to go. Thanks for watching today, and I will see you soon.